Welcome back to the series. In this video, we're going to show how this restaurant data comes from this backend Strapi table or collection and fetched to the front end and displayed using my framework's data layer. And to explain all that, let's go to a diagram. Yes, this one. As mentioned before, this framework has two parts. One would be the backend data layer, which directly connects to the Strapi, and the other part would be this front-end data management layer. And we have a handoff right here between the backend of the server side versus the front-end Redux layer right here. And the reason we need this handoff is because this is where the front-end user activities take place, by which I mean this stuff like filtering, searching, etc. For that, we need front-end based state management, and that's why we hand off to Redux. But for all these, for this second layer or the front-end state management layer, I'm going to dedicate one full video. But in this video, we're going to focus on just this backend data layer. From Strapi, hands off to a bunch of services, API client, HTTP service, which is a generic service. And then each collection would have a service dedicated. For example, here I'm saying post, but to get the restaurant data, it would be restaurant service. And then using these services, we're going to go ahead and enter to the data layer. That's where we would have a whole bunch of functions and methods and the data types and data structure all described. And from here, the data would be pulled in to the front end pages. The single ones here, and the list would be here, and a handoff would happen here, but we're not going to talk about that. But to describe this properly, we have to move to a better diagram with much more details. And with that diagram, we're going to keep doing back and forth from the diagram to the code and code to the diagram so that we can explain the whole process step by step. All right, so this is the full diagram of the data layer that I was talking about. And here we show that from all the way to Strapi backend, we use step by step the client, HTTP service, data layer service, then data layer, and we consolidate everything here to be able to use on our front end where the SSG and ISR is enabled and be able to display all the data we need. So let's go step by step. First, let's go look into this API client under the service folder in the code. This is where you can see the entire application structure, where we have the components, the context, data layer, features. That's where the Redux stuff is. Hooks, pages, services, etc., right? So we're going to start with the services, and this is where we find our Strapi client. So here, for our data layer, all we need to concentrate on are just this part right here. We're just collecting the Strapi API key from our .env file and the Strapi base API base URL, which pretty much says this: the DNS/API/restaurants, reviews, posts, etc. And here we're creating the Axios client by passing this API URL and authorization key. Just this much is good enough for now. Now let's go back to the diagram. So this API client actually helps us connect to the Strapi backend. And to connect to the backend, we're using the API key or the token that we showed how to create in the previous video. And once our connection is established, then we move to our HTTP service, which is a generic service using the generic data types. What I mean by that is at this point, our application does not know what type of data we're fetching or what kind of data structure it's going to be. Like whether it's going to be a cuisine collection or restaurant collection or post or review, whatnot. So let's go check this out in the code. So this would be our generic HTTP service, and this is going to use that Strapi API client with that connection. And here we have an interface for pagination. We have our generic API response, which we are bringing in, where we are adding this pagination here, because if you look at here and the return from every Strapi call or data call, what you'll notice is at the end, they actually provide this metadata, which actually holds the pagination information. So pretty much every collection call, we're going to have this. So in here, we just added that pagination, so our generic structure will be ready. And this one will handle the list, because this is an array, and this one will handle the single API response, a single piece of data, a list versus a single. And here I declared a class, calling it HTTP service, and this is where I'm actually writing all my generic methods, get all, get with a single one, and here a single one with a condition, which is get one by slug. So it's going to take a string where the it's going to use it as a slug, and here we have get one by ID, another string is going to use to collect the information by ID, because every data item in every Strapi collection has both a slug and an ID. So throughout the application, there are places that we're going to need sometimes to bring the data by ID, sometimes to bring the data by slug, and sometimes by any other kind of string. So this is pretty much open. Now let's go back to our diagram. So now that you have seen the generic HTTP service, so now it's time to be a little bit more focused. And this is where we're going to have specific collection-based services. Like if we're bringing in the cuisine data, then that will use the cuisine service, restaurant, post, review, etc. And this is where we are declaring the proper data structure for that specific collection, and we are actually mentioning which URL endpoint to use. Like cuisine service will declare the /cuisines, restaurant would be /restaurants, post, review, etc., etc. So now let's go back to the code. All right, so here under the services folder, we can see the post service is there, restaurant service is there. So let's look into the restaurant service. Yeah, it's a very simple one, but it is actually importing the HTTP service, and from that same service file is also getting the API response data type, which is the generic one, and also from the data layer it's also getting the restaurant entities or restaurant data, which is the data structure or data type for this restaurant data. It should look like this. Let's go under data layer, find restaurant entities, and this is what it actually looks like, the whole interface. I mean, these guys, we'll talk about them later, because this is where all the functions and methods are standardized, but actual data structure lies right here. Restaurant data, it would have ID and attribute, and then everything falls accordingly. Now, I'm going to show you an easier way to come up with this stuff, because what you can do here, you can just come here, let's say we're just getting the restaurant data, right? So you can just select one of them, copy it, just make sure your JSON is valid, and then go to a service like this, JSON to TypeScript, drop it right here, and if your JSON is valid, it's going to generate this structure for you. I'm just showing a simple one here, but more complex you put in, and that's going to give you a longer one. And just to notice here, I mean, since I didn't mention any name, it's just coming up with its own. And all you have to do is change these names into something like this, like restaurant, and then location data, and then photo, menu type, etc., etc. And trust me, all these I've gotten from one of those JSON to TypeScript application. And once you have everything set up like this, you have your data defined, and that's what this restaurant service would provide. It's going to go ahead and tell our HTTP service that when you make the request, you look under /restaurants. And if you look here, you will see that basic data structure is just like that. Pretty much every collection would have like ID and then attributes, and inside attributes, you're going to have all the rest of the data. And as I've shown before, for example, if you need more, you can just say question mark and populate star. I already have that. And then you're going to have the full structure here, photos, menu items, etc., etc. And you can take the whole thing, drop it in here to get something like this, a full-blown data structure. And that's what this restaurant service will be using. And the next would be to find the data and pass it over to all the methods and functions we would have in our data layer. Now let's go back to the diagram. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of our data service layer, now let's move to the data layer. Now this is where we're going to have one file dedicated for each collection, whatever we're trying to bring in. In fact, there will be two files. I forgot to mention here because one I've already shown, which would hold the data types or the data structure, restaurant.entities, and the other one would be, the main file would be restaurant.ts, post.ts, cuisine.ts, etc., etc., because that's where we're going to have all the necessary functions that we need to bring in the data. And at this point, we're going to combine these service objects to the generic methods that we build up here. Now we will have the cuisine service.ts, restaurant service.ts, etc. So these are going to be the objects coming from the service layer with the defined data structure, and this will be attached to the HTTP service as we've seen here. So with this kind of syntax, right, restaurant service.get all, restaurant service.get, get one by slug, etc., etc., we should be able to collect the exact target data we like. So let's go take a look at the actual data layer, and specifically here, restaurant.ts file. Okay, so to see all that, we're going to have to go under the data layer and restaurant.ts. This is where, as you can see, we have get all restaurants, get all restaurant by cuisine ID, get all restaurant by location ID, etc., etc. But if we open them up, that's when we actually see the structure of the function. And initially, we're creating the query qs.stringify. QS is a library that Strapi takes advantage of. And this is what turns the Strapi queries and make them look more readable. Like instead of doing it this way, like /API/restaurant/populate and start writing names or star whatever, what we can do, we can just use this qs.stringify and then have everything nicely laid out, like populate star, encode value only true, etc., etc. And like, for example, here when they get a little bit more complicated, like we add filters and then cuisine ID, ampersand cuisine, and then ID, and we provide the ID information here, because in this function we are actually receiving that ID as a number and passing it along. But this way, all the queries look much more readable. And don't worry too much about it, because I will dedicate one whole video just explaining how this works. But for now, let's look at our basic structure here, get all restaurants. And the main item here is this response equals await restaurant service dot get all, and we pass along this query. So at this point, you can see how everything ties together, because this restaurant service we're getting from right here, restaurant service, and this is where it actually utilizes this HTTP service and generic data structure, and then gets this restaurant data from the restaurant-entity files, which is also sitting. And remember, I said under the data layer, there will be two files each. One is restaurant entities and .ts, and other one would be restaurant.ts. So this is the one the restaurant data service is utilizing and shaping up the data structure. And then in the restaurant.ts, we are just using this object and .get all, which is also coming from this generic HTTP service. And as you can see right here, it's receiving a query string and get all using this Strapi API Client .get and this .endpoint, and this endpoint is coming from this service right here, /restaurants, and right here this is the endpoint, and this query coming from this file right here, and this is the query we're passing along with our get all, the service.getAll query going through this restaurant service. This is where we're actually giving it the actual endpoint, all going into this HTTP service, where a generic method get all is called, bringing in the query string object, and inside here, inside the Strapi client.get, it is actually getting this endpoint variable. So now it knows it has to go fetch the data from /API/endpoint, like here. /API/endpoint would be restaurants, and the query part, populate star, would come from right here via a qs.queryString. And thus, we would have all these functions ready to go and collecting data and showing it and delivering to us so that we can actually show them wherever we need. But to organize even further, what I'm doing is I am bringing all of them together and centralizing them to one single data object or data source object under services/index.ts. Let's go there. Data layer index.ts. So this is where I'm bringing in all the data layer stuff, like if it's a restaurant, if it's a cuisine, and their corresponding data structure, bringing them in, and then declaring an interface. Data source extends restaurant data source, cuisine data source, and then converting them into one single object, the data source. Inside that, I'm just spreading all of these, the Strapi restaurant API right here. Basically what it's doing, it's dropping all the methods necessary from this guy right here, restaurant.ts. As you can see, everything is exported, right? Export this, export that. All the necessary methods are being exported. And just because these methods are also part of this data structure, so in here, we have to define them. All these methods that we're bringing in, we have to also define them in the entities, restaurant entities. If you are dealing with post, then post-entities, cuisine.entities, etc., etc. So this is where you also have to declare an interface, restaurant data source. And we go back here, index file. So these guys are also coming. See, restaurant data source. So this our base interface extends these. That way, our main object also becomes part of everything. So now let's see how we are going to use this data source to pull everything into our front end. So let's go back to the diagram one more time. Here, since we centralized everything inside that index.ts, so now when we're working on the front end pages, we just now call the data source dot get all restaurants, data source dot get restaurants by slug, get all posts, etc., etc., and call them in our get static props method, and that's the one helps us generate the SSG and ISR. Well, once again, quickly, this SSG is basically the static site generation provided to us by Next.js. What it does is during the build time, it will collect all the data by making the calls to the Strapi backend and turning them into HTML, static HTML pages, and caching them so that after the build is done, the pages load extremely fast. This is the best advantage I found that we have using Next.js. So now that we have come this far, let's go to the main page, restaurant page, and see how we are utilizing this. So to go there, let's reset everything and go under pages, and in here, restaurants, as you can see, slug.tsx, that will give us the single page information, and the index.tsx will give us the whole list, and get static prop function, which is the server side function, we are actually calling in the data source dot get all restaurants. And we are collecting all the information as prop initial restaurants and handing over to our show all page content component as a prop initial restaurants. And this is where the handoff begins to Redux. But that we will cover on a separate video. But right now, we can actually see that how all the static site generation happens, and the framework gets all the data and passes it along to our front-end component so that we can just go here and let's go to the home page and go to, let's say, show all, and everything shows up just like they normally should. So, and right now, following that methodology, you can actually utilize any data structure or any collection, could be posts or cuisines or whatever, and you should be able to just display them right here and see how fast they load, only because Next.js is caching the data, and all this data it collected during build time and converted them into static HTML pages, and thus they're loading so fast, no delay, images and everything, they're already there. And that's the beauty of Next.js and the framework I created to collect the data from the backend. Now, before I finish, I need to show you something. While I was creating the data layer, all these functions, right? All these methods and stuff. So to test it, I needed a mechanism, right? So that's why, I mean, that's another reason I love Next.js so much, because under API, as you can see, all these backend stuff I created already. The restaurant by slug, restaurant by ID, all restaurant, etc., etc. So I created them. I'm not really using them in the front end, but these are going to be very handy when you are building your methods and functions, just so that you can see them at work. See, data source dot get all restaurants. How would that give you the data? You need to visualize it, right? So that's where, you know, all these functions are there for you to test them out in the front end. For example, see restaurant dash all, right? So if I go here and right here, if I just go, because Next.js also has an API layer, like this is not being done on the Strapi end, but this is being done on the Next.js end. And if I just say restaurants dash all and try to run it, boom, there you go. And look, it actually collected all the data and gave you right there from the front end. This is, look, localhost 4000. and the backend is localhost 1337, right? So even our front end has a nice little backend where we can actually test out all the data and know that how our functions and methods that we created inside the data layer will function, and is it actually giving us the data we need or not. So this I had to show you. I mean, even though all these things are not being used from the front end, because I'm centralizing everything and making the call via the steps that I showed you, but while you're preparing your data or methods, these are going to be extremely handy. And that being said, I will conclude this video where we explained my framework's data layer in detail, and on the next one we will cover the front end Redux state management layer. Thanks for watching.